Have you ever been reading an ancient religious text and just felt this sudden sense of shock at the sheer severity of what's written? You are absolutely not alone. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating theological investigation about how the foundational figures of Christianity actually read and handled their own, often shocking, sacred texts. It's a massive historical and textual debate, and it literally shapes how millions of people read these documents today. So, here's the big question. How exactly do we reconcile the seemingly harsh, judgmental God we see depicted in the ancient texts with the merciful, loving God revealed in Jesus Christ? It's a dilemma pretty much everyone grapples with at some point, right? Well, the source material we're exploring today maps out exactly how different theological camps try to solve this ancient puzzle, and why the solution you choose fundamentally alters the whole core of the faith. To unpack all of this objectively, we're going to follow a simple roadmap. First up, the Old Testament dilemma. Second, the revisionist view. Third, Jesus and the Scriptures. Fourth, the apostolic approach. And finally, reconciling love and judgment. Let's get into it. Part 1. The Old Testament dilemma. Let's look at the foundational tension at the very heart of this textual analysis. Our source anchors this whole debate in a famous passage from the book of Hebrews, which basically establishes the Orthodox baseline view of divine continuity. Take a second to really absorb what this is claiming. It argues that the very same God who spoke to the ancient fathers through the prophets is the exact same God speaking through the Son. So, no split personality here. According to this baseline, there's a direct, unbreakable line of inspiration connecting the ancient past directly to the present. Now, the crucial point in this debate is understanding two key terms, because scholars are constantly arguing over how to read these texts. The first is Christocentric. Think of this like a giant hidden puzzle. This view suggests the ancient texts secretly hide Christ in every single verse, just waiting to be uncovered. On the flip side, some thinkers prefer Christelic. That's more like a long, winding road leading to a final destination. The stories don't always literally feature Christ in the moment, but they're all ultimately moving toward him as their final goal, their telos. Grasping this difference is key to understanding how theologians process the really tough parts of the journey. Moving on to Part 2, the revisionist view. This brings us to a specific school of thought our author explores, one that tries to resolve this Old Testament tension by completely reevaluating the ancient texts. To protect the image of an all-loving God, modern revisionists usually rely on three main pillars to kind of explain away the harshness found in those ancient texts. These are basically theological frameworks specifically designed to soften the blow of divine judgment. So let's break down how the source explains each of these three distinct pillars. Okay, starting with their first point. The text notes that thinkers like Peter Enns argue the Old Testament authors were heavily limited by ancient Near Eastern cultural conditioning. The stakes here are incredibly high. It basically suggests that earlier writers were projecting their own violent, culturally biased lenses onto God's actions. So, in this revisionist framework, the later revelation in Christ actually corrects what those earlier culturally bound writers simply got wrong about God's true nature. The second pillar points to texts mentioning that angels actually delivered the law. The New Testament does refer to the Old Covenant as a message spoken through angels. So because angels were the intermediaries, some revisionists suggest, well, maybe the harsh, thunderous demands of the Old Testament reflect rogue angelic messengers rather than the true, unfiltered nature of God himself. It's an interesting attempt to distance the divine character from the really severe legislation of the ancient world. And finally, looking at the third pillar, the explainer references theologian Greg Boyd. Now, if God doesn't actively punish, what happens? According to this view, he simply withdraws. Boyd suggests God does not actively mete out violence or kill. Instead, this view argues God just removes his protective presence, basically allowing cosmic forces or human sin to naturally run their destructive course. So all that violence we read about, it's framed as a natural consequence, absolutely not a divine lightning bolt. All right, part 3, Jesus and the Scriptures. How does this revisionist view actually hold up against how Jesus himself interacted with these controversial writings? The source highlights a really vital moment on the road to Emmaus, right after the resurrection. It's a fascinating narrative detail. Jesus didn't discard the Old Testament, and he didn't apologize for its harsher tones. Rather, the text states he removed a metaphorical veil, revealing to his followers exactly how the law, the prophets, and the Psalms all perfectly and ultimately testified about him and his overarching mission. He embraced the whole shebang fully. And this is a crucial distinction. The source argues Jesus didn't correct or malign the Old Testament writers as being mistaken or culturally backward. Instead, he expanded their context. Think about the famous Sermon on the Mount. He elevated the standard from merely judging outward actions, like the physical acts of adultery or murder, to judging the inward heart and intentions. He amplified the law to its ultimate spiritual conclusion. He certainly didn't erase it or call it a mistake. The source also emphasizes that Jesus actually affirmed the historical accounts of God's wrath. He never treated them as mere myths or cultural projections. I mean, he literally drove traitors from the temple with a whip. He cursed a fruitless fig tree. And he routinely used the Great Flood and the destruction of Sodom as authoritative historical warnings for his own generation. The text notes that Jesus framed these historical judgments within the exact same context of his own love, justice, and impending return. That brings us to part 4, the apostolic approach. So how did the early followers, the apostles, handle these difficult texts once they were commissioned to spread the gospel? Did they shy away from the harsh parts? Well, the apostles used a method called typology. They frequently linked historical Old Testament events directly to New Testament theology, interpreting those ancient shadows as pointing directly to the substance of Christ. Take the Great Flood, for instance. Peter didn't just see the story of Noah as a tale of global destruction. He saw it as a profound typology of God's incredible precision in saving a remnant amidst righteous judgment. The harshness wasn't ignored at all. It was infused with deep redemptive meaning. Now, returning to that earlier revisionist argument about angels delivering the law, the source counters this by examining the historical context of royal envoys. In the apostolic context, a royal envoy carried the absolute, unquestioned authority of the sender. This means the early Christians viewed those angels not as rogue agents making things up, but as perfectly obedient messengers. Therefore, the source concludes, the apostles firmly believed the law still came directly and perfectly from God. The author also highlights Paul's writings in Romans 9 to examine what is perhaps one of the most difficult concepts in the ancient text: God intentionally hardening Pharaoh's heart. Instead of apologizing for it or, explaining it away as a cultural misunderstanding, Paul leaned right into it. He used this exact story and the powerful metaphor of the potter and the clay. Just as a potter has the absolute right over the clay to mold it for different purposes, the apostles affirmed God's ultimate sovereignty over human history, even in judgment. Which leads us to part 5, reconciling love and judgment. This is the author's final synthesis on how to hold these two seemingly opposing divine traits together without breaking the text. Drawing on early church fathers like Irenaeus, the source advocates for what is termed theological reciprocity. This is the argument that God's redemptive work was designed specifically to free man from the very sin he came to judge. It is a really profound synthesis. According to Irenaeus, you literally cannot have ultimate mercy without ultimate justice. They aren't at war with each other. The very act of God judging evil is what makes his love for humanity meaningful and protective. They're mutually reinforcing parts of the exact same divine character. And this brings us to the core thesis of our source material. The author concludes that attempting to strip God of his right to judge actually backfires completely. By trying to soften the Old Testament, revisionists inadvertently diminish the sheer magnitude of what the salvation narrative actually accomplished. Christ didn't come to fix a cultural typo, right? He came to save humanity from genuine righteous judgment. If the judgment wasn't real, the rescue completely loses its power. So, we're going to leave you with this final thought straight from the source material. Considering the unified approach of Jesus and the apostles we've just mapped out, how does this change the way we read the most difficult parts of history? Does a true Christocentric faith revise the historical texts or submit to a unified, authoritative story? Does understanding this change how you'll read these ancient texts? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep questioning and keep learning.